Hello and welcome to the recording of a digital campfire Let's Talk Public Art. This event was hosted by Lighthouse on the 5th of February 2021 and aimed to gather evidence to inform Brighton and Hove City Council's 10-year public art strategy through a shared vision. My name's Ali Beddoes. I'm the CEO and Artistic Director of Lighthouse, and we wanted to welcome all thoughts and deliberations from the audience within this shared virtual space. We believe that everyone that lives and visits a city are the public in public art, and we wanted to find out what people really thought about public art in Brighton and Hove and what it could and should be over the next 10 years. How nice to be able to think about a future for a moment. The event was one part of a series of public consultations. We're working with other community groups from across the city, and it's important to say that at this point we do not have all the answers yet, but we hope that these sessions will help us to get there. There are 5 films that we've made with some people from across the city to start the thinking. In the heritage film, E.J. Scott said that it's the engagement in the creation of public art which gives it heritage and identity. There's a process of passing that on almost like folklore through the generations. That quote resonates strongly with our intention for the community consultations. This 2-hour session was split into 2 chapters, where we started the discussion with introductions, a starting dialogue, and then opening it out into the virtual space, where we invited the audience to put forward thoughts and provocations. We tried to get through as many points and questions as we could and regrouped with a next step session. Quick thanks to Brighton and Hove Council for asking us to deliver this important piece of work. Thank you to all the panellists and to the speakers that contributed to the film so openly and generously. Many thanks to the Lighthouse team for keeping things running. And moving swiftly on, I'm delighted to be introducing you to the live session where Don Bailey, who is the co-founder and co-director of Baxter & Bailey and the co-chair of Brighton Experience Group, is the chair for the morning session and introduces the panellists. Over to Don. Enjoy.
This event forms part of a wide series of community consultations, as Ali has mentioned, to inform a 10-year public arts strategy. And the consultations are being skillfully led by Ali and Lighthouse and her team there, in close partnership with Bridget Sawyers Limited and Brighton and Hove City Council, both of which I'm delighted sit on our panel today. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Bridget Sawyers, a public art consultant who is writing the 10-year public art strategy for Brighton and Hove following this consultation period. Bridget and her team work with regional and local authorities, architects, developers, artists and designers, and they aim to integrate art, the public realm, architecture and great design for high profile, both public and private sector clients. So a really warm welcome, Bridget. Thank you for being here. And also to Nick Hibbard and Branwen Lorrigan from Brighton and Hove City Council. Nick leads the Economy, Environment and Culture Services for the city, and Branwen, the Arts Development Manager, who I'm sure many of you will know. I'm really pleased that you can both be here, Nick and Branwen, especially given the many pressures the council are under in relation to the pandemic. So thanks very much for joining us too. In order to open up the consultation process and get people thinking, 5 short films were produced involving a wide range of arts and cultural practitioners. I hope you've had a chance to watch them. Don't worry if you haven't, they're widely available on the internet, but don't worry about that. Each film involved 2 people in conversation with each other on the themes of public art and the role in the following areas. A greener city. The second film looked at connectivity and community. The third film talked about the places and spaces where public art can and could exist. The fourth around health and well-being and the power of art to support that area. And finally, a film that talked about public art in relation to heritage, which has been widely seen in the news of late. I'm really pleased to welcome 2 people from these films to the panel, Judith Ricketts and Atif Chaudhary. Firstly, Judith. Judith's an artist based in Brighton and Hove. She specialises in mobile screen-based art, interactive games and immersive real worlds. And she's also a lecturer at the University of Brighton. And Judith spoke to E.J. Scott, a historian and curator, on the subject of heritage. So a really warm welcome, Judith. And finally, I'd like to welcome Atif Chaudhary. Atif is an award-winning social entrepreneur with a background in economic justice and disability inclusion, focusing on the inclusion of marginalized communities. He's the co-founder and CEO of Diversity and Ability and social enterprise Zaytoun, the world's first Palestinian olive oil cooperative. Always good to have a world first. And he's also the trustee of Disability Rights UK. And Atif spoke about places and spaces and connectivity with Matt Adams of the interactive arts group Blast Theory. So a very warm welcome to you too, Atif. So with those introductions done, I'm now going to invite Judith and Atif to give us a flavour of their thoughts and findings to help warm us all up before we move into your thoughts and ideas and build on their conversation around heritage, places and spaces, and a better connectivity. So if I could invite Judith perhaps to start and tell us what rose to the surface for you and what you've subsequently been exploring with Atif, if that's okay. Thank you.
Hello, just checking you can hear me.
I can hear you, Judith.
Lovely, thank you. After the conversation, I thought very much about what I thought heritage was doing in the city or not. And one of the things I thought very much about was the fact that heritage is often seen as something which is fixed. I think it's fluid, it's constantly shifting and changing over time for me. And I think that I can't stress this enough. When you talk about the notion of heritage, you should be able to walk the city and recognise your contribution to the city. And that's my approach in my practice. I mean, I do this by finding archives or data and applying it to a question that I have that relates to place. Often there's a strong overlap with time and place and location, which can make the work very interesting. One of the things I think about when I think about Brighton is it has a lot of history. However, if you ask people what they think the history of Brighton is, you know, perhaps it might be about Prince Regent, perhaps it might be about the healing qualities of the sea, the pavilion, perhaps Queen Victoria rather. Now, obviously that's a very good start, but I would argue that if you traverse the city and the neighbourhoods with different voices and different stories to be told, there's like a rich tapestry that we're missing out on. And the key thing for me is that it needs official support, as this conversation seems to be suggesting, and the funding structure could do with changing so it's more fluid. So not just about statues for me, but and that which is, you know, that's a manifestation of culture, but very much seems to be suggesting a new contemporary model is needed.
Great, thanks, Judith. Atif, do you have anything to sort of weave into that in terms of perhaps the things that we're missing out on in relation to heritage that are there?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, heritage is inherent, isn't it? I mean, it's what we've inherited, whether we've had agency or choice or much participation in it. And that can be a gift and a burden all at the same time, because it's saying, look, we're protecting your heritage. That's culturally important to remember, that what brought the city together in the case of Brighton, and what's kept it steady over times of turmoil. But at the same time, you know, the question of participation is there, and it's really the theme, I guess, to what we're doing today. And then who gets to participate? You know, what was made invisible? What is the narrative? And there's always the danger, as we often should say, the danger of a single narrative, and what that creates for the city we live in. So it's, I guess I think Judith's really touched on it. It isn't a finished work. it's constantly reinventing itself. It's constantly re-examining what it is. And I think that's what good informed practice should be doing. It should be, it doesn't have to have a destination, nor should it really, but it is about sort of recognizing, look, how do we get folks participating if we have such systemic inequalities? How do we get people participating if, and I often say the equity isn't there to put the time and the risk into things. And these are things that we also desperately need to see. Brighton has a wonderful history in lots of ways, and its Regency history is part of that wonder as well, but it has a checkered history in terms of post-colonial legacies, even slavery ones. So I guess the art aspect of it is sort of recognizing that it's not imposing an elitism, you know, or even trying to save anyone. It's just there saying, you know, yeah, fluid is the right word, that it is. It's there as an invitation. And that participation has to be humble, particularly those who are creating the frameworks around it. You know, and I feel that humility, I suppose, is what's going to allow people to feel a sense of inclusion and a sense of participation. But it's not easy. It's years and years of work, because it's years and years of undoing and unlearning. And that's the tricky stuff. But I guess that's what we're doing here.
Great, thanks, Atif. I wonder if there was anything that came out in the places and spaces conversation that you had, and this idea of public art being in some cases permanent and in other cases transient, and linked to the places and spaces in which that public art can take place. Did anything occur in the conversations around that, about the temporary and the permanent, and the places and spaces in which things can happen?
Is that to Atif or to me?
Well, to either.
I just had a quick point I'd like to add to that, which is that, my tradition is showing work in art galleries. That's how I came through the art system. And I think that in a way starts to exclude, because not everyone's interested or comfortable with being in what is a white cube of the gallery space. And if we can think about ways, I touched on it before, where we can use unusual spaces to think about how to deliver cultural offerings, heritage offerings in different spaces across the city. That is certainly one of the things I think is going to be key as well.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I mean, just to add as well, I mean, I like the whole, and I don't come from an art background, so I'm mostly comfortable with that, I think. but I would say that I like the walking gallery aspect of it. I mean, look, I mean, I say this not as any running commentary, but as a guy who lives in Brighton, who raises a family in Brighton, who's and art in itself, it's there to awaken our senses. It doesn't have to be fixed. Some of the best art I've seen are things that I haven't even been able to see. I've just been able to smell. I don't know what that says about the art I like, but it awakens things that are that you don't have to just be about seeing. It's about touching. It's about exploring. It's about but knowing that it's free, that you don't that the invitation is addressing socioeconomics. It's addressing participation by saying, look, you'll never be charged for this, but it doesn't have to be static. I think the joy of it moving on and making space for the next innovation is part of its wonder. But I guess there is a shift to be able to say, and I'm not even going to pretend to start saying I know the answer to that, but what we define art to be in Brighton or anywhere else is a constant discussion.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thought, isn't it? And one of the questions that came here I'll just read it out. If Brighton and Hove's city and landscape were a gallery without walls, what art would you like in your local area as part of that city's collection? Sculpture, street art, art created or by the community, temporary and changing commissions. So this seems to be sort of very much at the heart of some of the things that came out in both of the discussions. Could I ask you to perhaps give us a flavour of what that could look like for Brighton and Hove? Not necessarily the answer, but a kind of like a sense of that. And Ali's put up a poll here, so please do participate in that if you can.
Yeah, I mean, I had a couple of thoughts around that. I mean, the first thing for me was it's about creating spaces where a sense of belonging can be performed, seen, heard, or even smelt, actually. And one of the notions I find, you know, particularly distressing is, we touched on it, is the notion that, you know, it's a single narrative, and it does need to create a sense of different kinds of voices. I think about Hove Plinth, love it or hate it, you know, I think it starts to address the physical and the digital way of thinking, which I think is really interesting. You know, a physical thing that can become fluid over time is really interesting. It's almost the institutional version of Pokemon, you know, although it's fixed. And this notion that making a city which is playable, which is permanent, which kind of you know, which kind of includes the voices of people is really important to me.
Atif, did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, but I guess and I think Judith's really saying it well. It's that kind of, I mean, part of the issues is that, and I've been say this as best I can, the shaking off that we have to do about legacies and traumas. And I'm not talking about that just in context of skin color, but rather class and identity. And that shaking off has to sort of recognize systemically, where are the wrongdoings that still prevent participation, even if there's an invitation there? Where are the barriers that still reinforce cynicism? And in that cynicism, what are we missing? You know, when people said, "Oh, I've been here, I've seen this before," etc., etc. You know, and these are the things that are, I guess we have to anticipate that they're there, that they've been there for a long time. And we have to anticipate that they will continue to play a role despite really positive and well-meaning intentions. And so with that anticipation comes a duty that says, okay, our welcome needs to really be open to sometimes getting a kick in. You know, it's a process. It's going to be a process that will last for many months, perhaps even years, but it will change, because it's a generational change that says, look, yeah, it was tough then, and yeah, I was cynical then, but actually I got to see people getting paid locally here to be doing this. I've got invitations here to be part of this, not just to, I guess, tokenize a framework, you know, or impose one, but really to put a stamp on it, even make folks comfortable in that process. But it was part of it. That takes an intergenerational change, and it isn't something that happens in a workshop or a meeting, but it takes time. But the visual aspect of that and the intent behind it can definitely be owned by generations coming forward. But we have to, I guess, really be comfortable with that lack of comfortability.
Yeah, thanks, Atif. I think the point you make there, sort of, you know, around class and inclusion are the forefronts of people's mind, and I think many people know that the council's recently made a commitment to become an anti-racist city, and you know, I know that there are many sort of facets to this conversation around heritage, but just with that in mind, I've got a question from of Simon Bannister, who's leading that work at the council, who I'll just read the question out. Our council has recently made a commitment that Brighton and Hove should seek to become an anti-racist city, stepping into the future where substantial progress has been made in securing this aim. What would it look like? How would we know we are an anti-racist city? And how could public art help us understand and navigate this? So it's this idea of, you know, how will we know when we are an anti-racist city, and what will it take to get there? Do you have any thoughts on that, or anything that you discussed that could respond to that?
Oh my gosh, that's such a huge question. It's the sort of thing that you need to constantly monitor, isn't it? It's, again, it's not a state, it's a shifting pattern of people's interests as communities change, as neighborhoods change over time. But the key thing, I think, is how do you measure belonging? How do you feel like you belong in a city? It's almost untouchable in a sense. But for me, there are obviously some fundamentals that kind of need to be addressed. We almost need to address the now and the then at the same time. The two things need to come together. The other key thing is, having events and festivals which are not just in the centre, which push people into other, or not invite, should we say, invite people into other parts of the city. I don't go to parts of the city because I have no reason to go there. It'd be great to be able to go there because there was some cultural event happening there. I think that that's part of our heritage here in Brighton, that there's always something happening. But you can be in parts of the city where you just think, this doesn't look like Brighton and Hove. It looks like it could be anywhere in the country, because there's nothing apparently happening here. I'm sure there's lots happening here in the locations, but it's for local people. It'd be great to kind of be involved in that in a way which is inviting. And I think the other key thing is how do you facilitate, getting people involved, and it can't be top down. It has to be from the individual locations, I think, and as Atif said, paying people who are from those locations to facilitate those voices and the outcomes, actually.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Judith. Atif, would you like to add into that? And then I'm keen to sort of start the process of bringing people in. I can see some interesting things coming up in the Q&A. So would you like to just build on that point, and then
Sure.
we'll dive in?
Yeah. Yeah, it is an important question to ask. I think it's a really great question to have asked. It's very difficult to have the context around anti-racism, about people defining what it actually means. I think it's a term that we're hearing more often now, and that's a great thing. But actually, it's a quote from Andrea Davis, isn't it? Andrea Davis said, "In a racist society, it's not enough. It's not enough to not be a racist. We must be anti-racist." Okay, but this Andrea Davis said this in 1979. So we're hearing the terminology around this 41 years later. I mean, take that should probably have anyone in the panel taking a deep breath. 41 years later, we're having this terminology as if it's new, as if it just arrived last year through the response around Black Lives Matters. So what we're talking about here is systemic change, and that systemic change comes. It needs to come, but it has to have the presence of justice. It has to have the presence of. It's not enough to say we're belonging, or there is belonging, and we're not even defining that, and nor can we easily, because it means so many things. But I mean, I put something in the chat about equity because I feel that that's a start of something. It allows people but to be an anti-racist city is really to recognize, and I often say this, look, to be an anti-racist city, you have to recognize, what is it costing people to speak out? It's not enough for it to be an edict from a mayor or a city councillor or even a PR or on a website. It has to be recognizing, what does it cost a nation? What does it cost an individual? What does it cost a city when the most marginalized voices do speak out? And art is a credible way of bringing that together, because it allows that space to speak at times, if the intent is there and the frameworks are there about participation. But I think anti-racism, an anti-racist position cannot make sense unless you're looking at the systemic barriers that prevent that participation. Otherwise, it's a new word. It's a word that people are not really owning. And I don't think that Brighton is that city. I think Brighton is a city that's responding to a lot of changes over the last 2 or 3 years in America, and recognizing, I think, the role it's played and can play. I think the removal of the plaque on Edward Corrington, I think, was an example of a debate. I'm not a fan of things getting smashed up or removed, but I am a massive fan of saying, what did they provoke in us as citizens of where we live, and how do we visit the injustices that were perpetrated through this? So I guess, yeah, so I guess the answer is, can art play a role in anti-racism? I think yes, but fundamentally, can it shift it? I think that's going to take a lot more than art to do that. It's going to take people's sense of, look, there are too many things happening here that can perhaps not be achieved in our lifetime, and we've got to acknowledge that. But we've also got to make sure that a generation after us isn't having this same conversation 41 years later.
Great. Thanks, Atif. Lots to consider and think about there, and I'm sure we'll see sort of questions being voted up around that topic. So thanks for opening that up for us. I wanted to come to a question that's at the top of the Q&A, bringing back the conversation to this idea of, you know, a gallery without walls, and it's a question from Phil. Phil Bolton. Can we unmute Phil? And Phil, would you like to put this question to the panel?
Phil, if you could press the raise your hand button if you'd like to put that point forward yourself, I can unmute you. Thank you very much.
Is Phil there? Shall I ask the question on Phil's behalf, perhaps? No? Okay.
There we go. I think that's worked now. Hello.
Hi,
hello,
Phil.
everyone.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's already very informative. It was just a question around, we have a lot of arts and cultural events in the city already. One thing that one event that we work on up in Durham is Lumiere Festival, and something that seems to work very well up there is they retain a piece of art from each of those events, a sort of a legacy piece, and the community and the residents seem to really, you know, be proud of that piece of artwork, because it reminds them of the massive event that they have every 2 years, and sees a real connection with that. I was just wondering if that's something the panel have considered. You know, we have a lot of temporary artwork come in and go in with events in the city, whether it's something that we could look at a legacy art piece from one of those events.
It's a really good point, Phil. Atif, Judith, would either of you like to respond to that?
I would like to respond to that. I think that's a very good idea, Phil. I think that one of the things that happens, for example, with the digital festival, brilliant event, but I would like to have seen, you know, some data, some archive, something that is, you know, has permanent place somewhere in the city that could begin to build some, you know, that I'm interested in this idea of the future archive. But something that's visual would be great as well, I think. Yeah, brilliant.
Same, I guess not much to say to that from the other than, yeah, absolutely. I mean, some sort of time capsule sounds a joy to me, but it's not so much hidden or locked away, but rather saying that what does progress look like? And again, embracing the humility of things that could have been done differently, and then showing it for a generation afterwards. There's a lot of forgiveness attached to that as well, and also just connecting to those hidden dynamics.
Great, thanks, Atif. There's another poll gone up there if people would like to kind of perhaps spend a little bit of time with that. The question is, the best public art is art that. So please do participate in that if we can. Can we come to back to the topic of sort of inclusion? And I've got a question from Curtis here. Hi, Curtis, and I remember you asking this question at the summit. So I'd like to bring Curtis in now, because it does kind of highlight inclusion and participation in these conversations. And I think Atif, you'll and Judith, you'll be able to speak quite helpfully to this question. So can we bring Curtis in to ask his question, please?
Hi, Dom. Yeah, I think I'm here.
Hi.
Hi. Thanks for taking the question. So I guess, I mean, my interest really is in estates on the outskirts of Brighton. I grew up in Whitehawk. I was chair of Brighton People's Theatre, so I've kind of, you know, in the past done quite a lot of work around kind of, I guess, cultural stuff. But it feels like it's this drum that I'm constantly having to bang when I come to these events. Where are the people that have similar backgrounds to me on these panels? You know, where are the people from Whitehawk, and how many times do I have to ask that question before something's done about it? I know work is being done, you know, don't get me wrong, I'm aware of stuff that's going on in the background, but time and time again, I come to these kinds of panels and I don't see any faces from those areas as key panelists. And I'm just wondering what needs to happen to kind of, you know, for that to change. And one other point, you know, there's massive inequalities in our city, and the image that's portrayed of Brighton and Hove is of this cool place where really cool creative stuff happens. But actually, for a lot of people in this city, that isn't the picture they have. What they have is a picture of struggles and you know, not having much money, and you know, that I don't really think that's borne out. And I'm interested in what we do to close those gaps.
Thanks, Curtis. Great question, and I think I'll come to Atif if that's all right, Atif, because it's really kind of central to some of the things that you were exploring with Matt in the Places and Spaces film. But also, if you wouldn't mind offering some thoughts about that, you know, very clear kind of ask of Curtis around. Seeing people from the city, a wider sort of representation from the city, not only perhaps on these kind of events, but also in art practice and the development of public art itself.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks, Curtis. I can't answer why folks with such experiences aren't on this panel or any panel. I think you know, it's frustrating to still imagine Curtis to be asking that question time and time again. My own experiences. I mean, I grew up in one of the largest council estates in the country, a place called Thamesmead, and yeah, I mean, crikey, so there were loads of things around, and I think for me, as I often say, like, it gets lost in the idea of cultural or racial identity, but it is about class, which overlaps into cultural and racial identity. When I think about the London riots, for example, at the time, I came to Brighton 7 years ago. At the time I was living in Lewisham, and we lived on a road called Coldbath Street. And I'll try and bring the relevance to this, is that when the riots happened in Lewisham, you know, it was like a shock and etc. And it went right through areas of Greenwich, Blackheath and Lewisham. But the challenge for me was, look, why is it so tough for people to understand? Like in Thamesmead, it was a massive, it's a 5 square mile council estate. We were all in the same social fabric of reasonable poverty at times. But what we didn't have is constant reminders that we were different. We lived in this ginormous enclave. We actually didn't know we were different until they started doing parliamentary debates. I remember that, and watching Thamesmead being talked about by John Major and things like that. And I thought, wow, we're famous. And I couldn't really understand that we were growing up in a particularly different place because it's so big. My sense of familiarity, my sense of who looked like me, no, it wasn't a particularly brown area, it was quite working class. Then I go back to Lewisham and I think, well, what happened there? Well, Coldbath Street, the name says a lot about dockers and who lived there, but next to Coldbath Street is Blackheath. Next to that are the people working in the Canary Wharf. And so what are kids seeing? Kids are seeing social inequality. They have a consistent reminder. So it wasn't poverty, but a social inequality that's preventing participation, that's reinforcing cynicism. And with that, we're going to inherit another generation that will be part of that social inequality as Brighton gets to grow as a cultural city, as it grows with its arts, as it grows with its wonder with students, and unless it can recognize that. You know, and unless it can recognize that participation, and we're going to pay the cost for that. I'm not saying that because I want to be bleak at all. I hope not. But I guess I'm someone who's fortunate enough to be able to have had these lived experiences of social isolation, but also had a chance through time, and it took me a lot of time to even, you know, I left school at 16, to be able to go to places and access a different cultural environment. It took me a long time. I couldn't imagine as a kid that I'd end up living in Brighton, let alone running a business in it. So these challenges are there, and I think it's going to architecturally need really what Curtis has said, to have these lived experiences to inform that process, to teach us what good looks like when it deserves to be great, not good enough. Yeah, I guess, yeah, thank you, Curtis, for the question, really.
Great. Thanks for the response, Atif. You know, it seems very much that, you know, facing kind of that reality head on will absolutely, there's great rewards in doing that. I'm going to bring in Sarah Davies now, who makes a good point in relation to this, I think, in terms of wider participation and the right kind of participation across the city. Who, well, I'll let Sarah kind of ask the question, but she makes this point about an organisation like the one that she runs knows these communities. It works with them and it's familiar, and perhaps she can kind of ask that question, and we can kind of build on this theme. Sarah, would you welcome? Would you like to ask your question? Can we unmute Sarah?
Hi, can you hear me?
We can. Go ahead, Sarah. Hi.
Hi, thanks very much, panel. Yeah, you know, the work that we do at Phoenix and Lighthouse and Fabrica and, you know, Blast Theory, all the big organisations, we have community at our heart because we all have that responsibility to work with underrepresented groups. And my feeling as chief executive of an arts organisation is that there's tons of this stuff happening anyway. And of course, what we want to do is projects that come from the grassroots up. So Curtis's point, I completely agree with Curtis in terms of the panel and the mix. And my God, next time we'll have perhaps a different panel. But my view is that it's all about community engagement, and the arts play a huge role in that, and it's already happening. So this conversation is great, but my feeling is like, well, where are we getting to? The 10-year art strategy will be written, but so where's the funding coming from? And you know, who do we need to advocate to in terms of what we can do in this area of public art?
Great, thanks, Sarah. If you don't mind, as a kind of a bit of a two-question thing, I'm also going to ask Katie to come in here as well, who also kind of makes a linked point about the involvement of artists and co-writing briefs and the involvement of artists kind of within the plan. So Katie, would you mind asking your question too, and then perhaps we can bring these sort of this sort of theme of wider participation together for Atif and Judith.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
Right.
Katie.
I'm an artist. I started off working as a youth worker and community worker in Oxford quite a long time ago, and a lot of the work I've done in the last 15, 20 years has been very much engaged with communities. And one of the things that, as I kind of became an artist and called myself an artist, I found really troubling about public art is the way that briefs are just handed down to artists with a preordained outcome. And often that is one that maybe invites community engagement, but it comes from, you know, commissioners and councils. It doesn't involve artists in the writing of the briefs, working with communities to write those briefs. And I know that some organisations in Brighton, like Phoenix, are doing really great work on this front, but personally, I'd like to see in this strategy some real thinking about long-term engagement, long-term embedded engagement by artists with communities, rather than bringing in short-term commissions that have a preordained outcome that doesn't offer that kind of openness to all different voices here. And I just also wanted to quickly say something else about this idea of engagement and participation, which I think we need to consider, which is that it's not necessarily going to give us an outcome where everyone's in agreement. And how do the panel feel about that, where potentially we've got a situation of antagonism by different voices, different communities and different needs? So sorry, I added 2 questions there. I'll shut up.
I think they're great great questions and build on Sarah's point too. Atif or Judith, who would like to go first on this one?
What am I talking about are outcomes and briefs. An excellent point, Katie. I think that it's going to take a brave organisation to formulate a brief which is loose enough to potentially have no outcome, or an outcome that they were not expecting. You know, so broad that actually it gives the thing space to grow in its own time and location. That would be amazing. Also quite scary, I think, but I think potentially that is what is needed. I personally would love that situation, and I absolutely agree with you in terms of longevity and embedded participation over time. I think that's what the structure is going to need, because that's the only way I think that you can begin to kind of capture how things are changing over time. You know, this is a piecemeal approach to making work by local, non-local. Where is it? Where can you find it? You know, we kind of need to be able to find it, capture it, maybe remake it, change it, update it, all of those things. That's my view on the thing. So not much opposition there. And, you know, again, it also needs to, you need to be thinking outside the box if you're going to think that everyone is going to agree, because as many people as you have in the room, as that will be as many opinions that you have. And what do you do with that? I think that it's about setting up the parameters to be able to do that, really. And so that people are happy that they might not be happy at the end of it.
Great. Atif, would you like to respond?
Yeah, sure. Within balance, and I don't know if I, you know, I'm quite a fan of antagonism, yeah, to an extent, you know. And I suppose that's the problem, is it who gets to call to what extent? Where's the balance? Agitation is healthy, you know. It is healthy for. I don't think there's an epoch-changing event in the world that's ever happened without antagonism. You know, the civil rights, the women's right to vote, end of slavery. These things have come out of antagonism and disarray and sometimes distrust, or often distrust. And so art and meaningful art won't be any different to that, and it shouldn't be. But it's just saying, okay, can this process be just workable with such different voices? Or has it got to be really humble in order to be peaceful? And if it's very peaceful and humble, are we sure that we were participatory? It's going to be quite a mix of things. The challenge then is what are the demands we're putting on people to make sure that we're not responding to questions that are coming from folks like Curtis and others. What is it that we're doing that's perhaps raising our own sort of defensive postures when we're being challenged in this way? It's a really difficult process, but probably meaningful because it is.
Can I ask it to just weaving the kind of the things that we've heard together? So Sarah's point about already working with communities and knowing the city really well, and then Katie's point, which really kind of made a lot of sense, which is embedding artists in the process itself. You know, allowing them to do what they do best. You know, rather than be delivered the restricted brief, you know, involve artists and practitioners in a way that kind of opens up the potential, and perhaps in doing so we involve more people, we understand more, we start to see these things that you described as the hidden things that become visible, more visible, and perhaps not forgetting that, you know, art and public art experience at its best, you know, has the capacity to delight and engage and inspire, and you know, whether it's something physical or a smell or something that's happening on the street. Is there any way that you and Judith can perhaps sort of bring those things together for us in to help inform this process?
Yes.
I'm sorry to put you on the spot. It's now not looking for an answer, of course. It's just ideas on how better to do it, because it seems that, you know, in Curtis's question and Sarah's and definitely Kate's, there's this sort of these barriers that we perhaps need to deal with in order to get further down the road.
Yeah. You know, my thinking is that often artists are embedded in the process, but one of the key things is it then colours their process, because, you know, obviously I create digital work, that's what I'm interested in creating. Other artists create other kinds of work. You almost need a neutral facilitator, if there is such a thing in the world, who can work with people who are already working with organisations to help eke out a potential brief, and so therefore make it fundable, if that's the route we're going. It's a very difficult question, and, you know, my first thought is it needs a facilitator who's open-minded enough to think outside their own practice, if it's going to be an artist.
Great. Thanks, Judith. I think we're going to head to a really short break now. But before we do, I'd love to sort of squeeze, you know, one final question in, if we can, before we have a little break, and that's from Steve. And apologies, Nick and Branwen, for this one, but it's certainly something worth considering. So, Steve, would you like to ask your question to the panel, and perhaps we'll get a quick response on that before we have a break?
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you, Steve.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Just before I ask the question, I just want to say how excited I am about this conversation, because I was really lucky to be working with the council back in 1990, setting up the first public art policy with great councillor Jackie Lythell, who is wonderful. But also back in those days, the council had their own landscape architects department. There was more than one landscape architect at that time. And of course, landscape architecture, I think, is one of the unsung heroes of public art, in that I've had to collaborate with landscape architects on a number of projects, and I've always found them very, very creative and cooperative and collaborative and community minded, perhaps more than architects. And you know, at the moment, a lot of the public art gets funded through the building of new developments, and the money actually comes from the private sector. So whether that's what is going to continue to be the case, whether that'll be the main route for funding works or not, but I think that there's just this real, it is really important, especially if you're creating new public spaces like that wonderful new landscape down at Grand Parade, to not end up in a situation where the design of spaces is either something you buy from an external contractor, or something that goes to a statutory responsibility of the authority, like highways, who aren't really, without wishing to be rude about them, they're not really best placed to be creative and not really used to working with artists. There's a very different mindset. So I suppose the heart of my question is, how do we, and I love the high level philosophical discussion that I think is so important to have that discussion first that we're having now, but how does that feed into the relationship between landscape architecture and artists and the public to create fantastic re-energized spaces in the city that are really enjoyed by everyone, whatever part of the city you live in?
Thanks, Steve. It's a great question. I'm going to throw that open to Atif, Judith, or in fact Bridget. But would anybody like to volunteer to just pick up on Steve's question?
Yes.
Judith, great. Thank you.
I think that's a great question. I would even take a step back from that, Steve. I would consider that we use the spaces that we've already got, the open spaces. It's almost a crossover between, landscape architecture and digital creative urban planning almost, I don't know, while we find pockets in the city and make work in those spaces. And so we're not having to kind of wait for things to be funded, to be made special, so that we can use them now. I think that would be amazing, a street, in Whitehawk, etc., street somewhere down the other end of the city, etc., making a festival, a place where you just come together and you're not waiting for infrastructure things to happen, because those are long drawn out projects, and it almost needs a high level over someone to oversee the city as a whole, and to kind of identify what those pockets might be or not. Maybe the communities should identify what those pockets should be and put work on in those spaces, but with the support of this organisation, an organisation that sees the value in creating work in spaces which already exist.
Great. Atif, anything to add?
No, just to say that this is the wonder of it, isn't it? The process that we're doing, the joy. There is that so much of celebration here on the table. It's fantastic. I agree. I mean, the paying artists, but local artists, and there's no shortage, I think, in Brighton of wonderful artists. There's a shortage of, I think I said that in the film, of people being able to access the good they want to do because of difficult relationships and quangos and contracts and things that make it very bureaucratic. But there's so many great opportunities to celebrate that what Brighton's got to offer. It's bursting at the seam. But yeah, I guess how do you, like I said earlier, it's creating that employment gaps, which makes it easy and sustainable, but also, I guess, questioning where the elitism of academy and that sort of stuff is there, and what that plays in preventing that celebration being made real. It's even this conversation, however, whatever tension points are there, it's brilliant, isn't it? That we're doing it. It's such a hopeful conversation to have.
Very much so. Bridget, did you have anything that you kind of like to add there, or shall we move to the one final question before we break at 11?
There's so much that's been said, and actually, Steve, really important points. So I just kind of say that as we kind of develop, and it will be in partnership with the council, some of the mechanisms for delivery of the strategy in particular, we're already beginning to try and work with those departments who are less creative potentially, and we are trying to up the creativity levels. So that is definitely an area that we're targeting. We're trying to kind of infiltrate public art across the council as much as we possibly can.
Brilliant.
I'll say some more later on that.
Great, thanks very much, Bridget. In some of the responses to the polls, and I can see it occurring in the questions too, there's lots of reference to the Foxton Triennial, which I think weaves together quite a lot of what we've been talking about in terms of, a city, a gallery without walls, wider participation, a really sort of rich and varied programme that brings surprise. So we'll perhaps come back to that after the break, because we'll be talking about the themes of health and well-being, and a greener city, and a better perhaps tangible feeling from what public art can sort of bring in a city. And I think that's really good to think about. And with that in mind, I wonder if, just before we close for the break, I could ask, I'm sorry, I've lost the question for the moment. Yes, it was Anna. Anna Dumitru. Hopefully I've said that correct. Anna, would you like to, it was in response to Phil's point, but would you like to perhaps open up what you know about Foxton Triennial for us, and we can be thinking about it and return to it after the break?
Can you hear me?
We can, Anna, go ahead.
Okay, good. Yeah, so I was just thinking, like, when I go to Foxton Triennial, you just see all these works that have been building up over the years that they keep installed. And one that particularly springs to my mind is the Christian Boltanski bench, where you sit on it and it's got a sound work embedded in it, and you look out to sea, and it talks about the First World War and the soldiers and things like that. It's these stories, and that wasn't commissioned for the last triennial, but it's still working, it's still there. And they have these other works, I think the lamppost work, that they've got this altered lamppost type piece as well, and things like that. And they keep several pieces, I think, every time, which is a wonderful strategy for doing it, because there's a massive buzz around having the artworks installed, and when it launches and you get the international art community, but those really high quality works remain there. So it creates a destination as well for art, people who are interested in art. And they've got I don't know if they've still got it there, but they had an amazing Lubina Hamid piece and things like that, because I haven't been there since the pandemic. So yeah, I just thought that is a really good way of doing it, because you get the funding in to do the triennial type stuff, and then the work becomes permanent. So it's cheaper, you get these like international things, you know, there's strategies for sponsoring that sort of stuff as well.
I think that's a really great point, Anna, and a similar story in the Thames Estuary as well, where you know, bigger investment and funding is allowing the sort of the heritage and the narrative of the place's history in the form of a festival, and celebrating the kind of multidisciplinary nature of arts and culture. And the point about permanence is really valid, I think. You know, something that kind of lives on sort of beyond the experiences is really useful. So thanks very much for that. I think we will be returning in 10 minutes, if that's okay, to come back and talk about what the role of public art is to support a greener city and health and well-being within the city. So a really nice way to end that first session, I think. Welcome back, everybody. I've just been reading through the questions during that break, and there's lots picking up on some of the things that we've been talking about already. But with I'm also really keen to sort of move into you know, other aspects of how public art can inform this strategy, and I think this session is particularly wants to be focused around health and well-being and the idea of public art and how it can inform a greener city. So again, if I could perhaps come to Judith and Atif, do you have any thoughts on this, on the role of public art in relation to health and well-being and a greener city and a better environment? And hopefully we'll start to see and weave in some of the questions in relation to this topic. Is that okay? Can I hand over to Judith?
Okay, yes. A greener city, I think the first thing is it would be great to have spaces which had less cars in them. Sorry, I'm going to be very controversial. Where you could cycle more safely, which isn't necessarily just the seafront, and stop off and look at and enjoy work, and just slow down a little bit. You know, even on a commute, it would be nice to be able to interact with something artistic. But obviously, I'm slightly biased because I'm an artist. But that's my view. Slow down, make the city more amenable to walking around would be great.
Great. That idea of, yeah, slowing down and exploring things and allowing things for you to experience that a little bit more.
Yeah.
Atif, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, just, you know, it's the same, isn't it? That tranquility, and where does it invite itself in Brighton? You know, what does it, and how accessible is it? It comes with a greener city, of course, and it comes with those protected places. And I know we've got the Downs because that's where I live, right up there. And it's great, it's wonderful, it's awesome. Can't imagine a life without it. But I think that the town of Brighton, yeah, it definitely needs that more safeguarding. It's very hard to have a health agenda without a mental health agenda. You know? In fact, you can't. I'd say. So where Brighton recognises that, you know, and so that this is part of participation as well. That it's just a safe place to be, and this area is a particularly safe place to feel comforted by without cars or distractions.
Yeah, great. I'm really intrigued by this idea that you know, public art and the experience of that is woven into the city in a way that you perhaps you don't sort of necessarily sort of recognize it, but feel sort of a huge benefit from it. I'd like to bring, I'm sorry, there's no name here, but DDM to ask a question. If they're still with us, and they talk about something that I noticed when I first moved to Brighton, which is the buses. They all have names, and they extend that like that. And this idea that, you know, transport and getting around the city is a great sort of gallery in itself potentially, and it makes me think about not only the art that you experience on the commute, but also the bus itself in relation to, you know, 2030 in a carbon neutral city. It really kind of gets you thinking about the potential of all of that. DDM, are you there? And would you like to ask your question to the panel?
I'm really happy to allow you to speak, DDM, if you want to. Maybe raise your hand if you'd like that on the button.
No?
Not yet.
Shall I ask it then in that case?
Oh, actually, stop, Dom.
Fantastic.
Go for it. We can't actually hear you. You aren't muted, so maybe it's the sound.
DDM, are you there?
No.
What should we do at this point, Ali? Shall I read it out?
Sorry, we can't hear you. So Dom, could you read the point out? That would be great.
Yeah.
Apologies, DDM, we can't hear you.
Sorry about that. I'll read it. I love the way the buses in Brighton are named after people who had a role to play in our history, and it's interesting to read about who they were and why they were important. It would be great to see something similar, but with art on the buses. If each bus features some unique artwork, for example, everyone could see it, and that way. And sorry, I just moved. Apologies. Everyone can see it and look out for specific ones. Imagine standing at the Ulstein and spotting all the different special art buses. There's a kind of cow parade sort of feel to that question, if I've interpreted it correctly. But lots of potential, I think, in the objects and infrastructure and things around us. Does Atif, do you have any kind of thoughts on that, and perhaps opening up this idea of how that relates to health and well-being in a greener city?
Sure. Yeah, I think the buses, why not? I mean, so many people using them, need to use them. I guess that narrative around the easier to ignore, the hard to reach, etc., are the very folks that are going to be using the buses. So why not? I also really like. I mean, it's one of the joys of Brighton, is it, that the buses are different to other places. I think maybe Judith had something to do with this, but I remember getting on a bus on the 46 going to Hollingbury and learning about Thomas Highflyer, and I would not have known that, and I got to read that, and it made me want to Google and so it's absolutely there's endless possibilities there. It'd be nice not to have adverts on them, but just have things that showcase this, isn't it? Right? Just this and sustaining that.
Can I ask a little bit about the small intervention versus the larger intervention? So this idea that the buses would be, quieter and perhaps more frequent, and there might be less cars around them, for example. So these sort of bigger kind of impacts versus, actually in the journey towards that, and the things that you were describing earlier about the process that we go on, how the smaller interventions make a big difference too. Do you have any thoughts on that? Small versus big? Because I think we tend to think big, but it's not always necessarily essential that we do that.
Yeah, sure. I just want to check, Dom, you're asking me, right?
Yes, if that's okay, and then perhaps
Sure,
Judith,
sure.
I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't know if it's about big or small. Rather, it's about intent, you know, and the safety of that intent. And so the small things. I mean, we know that from our own human relationships. The small things that people do for us are actually the windows to the big things that they really are to us and what they mean to us. It's the same, isn't it? And we can apply that to the city we live in. It's those little small caring things that are easy to not choose to pay attention, to not resource, or to say it's not sustainable, are the very things that people remember. Just this thing, look, somebody come up with an idea of naming the buses after famous people in Brighton and gave legacy, and here we are talking about it. It's a small thing that's actually a big thing. It talks about culture without having to use the word, you know? Yeah.
I think it's a great. I also love the names of the buses. Just chip in there, but you know, it does make you think. You know, is there further we could go with that, perhaps, or is there ways in which that could be extended or interpreted? Judith, did you have any thoughts on this?
Hey, I'm glad to be reminded of the buses. Actually, I think that they're a great opportunity to kind of introduce people to ideas, and you know, I did in a small way have something to do with the Thomas Hyde Flyer. I worked on the project, when I, you know, that for me had me notice the names of buses. I mean, I have to say that we do a good job in terms of buses in Brighton. We do have Wi-Fi, and you know, there's potential when you're on the bus to kind of look stuff up. You know, that's free. Maybe there could be some augmented reality there. Obviously, that's me kind of. That's my thing, but I like that idea. Also, quite like the idea of small interventions. One of the things I really like about Brighton is that I do feel as though I know quite a lot of people. You know, it's a city that's knowable in the sense that, you know, if you go to London, you get swallowed up quite quickly, almost a different scale of city. But I mean, you know, we do quite well here. I do feel at home here. One of the things I miss about being in London are the large gallery spaces, but equally, I don't think the city's set up for that. And I think distributed spaces, small interventions really work. You know, this notion of slowing things down and incorporating the kind of peace that you might get sometimes walking along the seafront in the centre of town is still a bit frantic. And it would be quite nice to kind of have smaller interventions, as I said, less transport, fewer cars, etc., and more interventions there.
Yeah, thanks, Judith. This idea of a sort of quieter, less congested city does seem to be very conducive to, you know, better public art experience, and I know there's a lot of work being done on that. Speaking of kind of ease of doing things, so starting with the buses.
Sorry, Dom, I was just going to say that we had a few raised hands from the attendees while that conversation was happening.
Right. Bring someone in. Yeah, please do. Sorry, I missed that. I missed that, Ali.
We've also got Nellie Lewis and Mike Stubbs. So, oh, Nellie. Okay, Mike. I'll go with Mike because he was the most recent, if that's okay.
Please do.
Most big apologies, but I didn't have a question.
Okay.
I think I might have done that accidentally, but hello, and it's a great discussion you're having, so carry on.
Well, it's great to have you here, Mike.
Okay, all right, cheers. Thank you.
Tala, I'm going to allow you to talk, and if you didn't want to, that's fine too.
Well, okay, just as quickly as I can, I suppose.
Okay.
How do we find any notion of true representation as a question? And can we have representation? And how do we find the right representatives when there can be some very loud voices within different communities? Over to you.
Good point. Thanks, Mike. Judith, Atif, I think we did talk a bit about this in the first half. Would you like to perhaps sort of summarize your thoughts on that, and then we'll move to the next question? Oh, you're muted,
Ali's
Ali.
saying something. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Please do, Judith and Atif, respond to that point, but just to say that Tola is unmuted, and if she'd like to comment on anything around environment, green city, connectivity, etc., to do that after Judith. Thank you.
Yeah, just remind me of the question again. Sorry, I was thinking about someone else coming in.
It was covering the point of better representation, how we achieve it, but crucially how we find it.
Yeah, that's kind of how long's a piece of string and trying to get hold of water, really, isn't it? It's difficult because truth is variable, unknowable, and difficult. So I know that some communities have individuals who have bigger voices, but that's the job of the facilitator, isn't it, to ensure that everyone's heard. So that's my take on that, really.
Great, thanks, Judith. Shall we move on to the following raised hand, Ali, if that's okay?
Go for it, Tola. Welcome.
Hi, Ali. Thank you. I just wanted to say that I think it's fantastic what everyone's saying about Brighton being a walking city. I think that's such a good point, and a walking gallery. And it just made me think about a project that I heard about recently that I think would actually be a small intervention that would potentially work really beautifully in Brighton, which is the art run. I don't know if you've seen, there's one in London and there's one in Liverpool as part of the Biennale. And somebody has just worked to make a lovely map of the city, highlighting, the different public artworks that are around the city. And then it's a 5K running route or walking route. So it sort of ties in with your thinking about wellness and health, as well as connecting all different people with the artworks that maybe they didn't realize existed in different parts of the city. So yeah, I just wanted to share that, really. It's called Art Run, and I think it'd be something that wouldn't be difficult to get going in Brighton.
Thanks, Tola. I've not heard of Art Run, but knowing what I know about Brighton is quite an active city. That seems to make a lot of sense. It'd be really interesting to start to think about what the stops off on the route were, and perhaps that's all the more reason why we're here today. Really good point. Have we got any other raised hands, Ali? No. Can I kind of link Tola's sort of point to kind of another easy win? We've talked about buses, perhaps an event or an activity like the art run. And there's a question at the very top of the Q&A here from Elaine, who talks about something we're all really aware of, really, which is there's a lot of empty space in the city and around the city that can be put to great use. And it feels very much like an easy win in all of this to, open up and utilize some of that to better effect. Elaine, would you like to come in and hopefully I've done your question justice, but put that question to the panel?
Yes, it came about because of all these shops collapsing, and there's going to be big spaces available, which will just be boarded up if we're not careful, and make the city look appalling. So I would love to see the council have some proactive way of making sure these spaces are used in a nice, creative way. And galleries is obvious, and also combining those, so not just a gallery, so it's just a gallery, but combining it with spaces for artists and also theatre, I think. It will take a bit of doing, but I do think if the will was there to start with, once these spaces start appearing, then it would be great to have some emphasis on it being used for art. And some of those spaces, for example, in the Churchill Centre, they're in the middle of, people go, I don't know if people will be going in there much if they're not buying anything, but it's they're good spaces where people just come in naturally, which is, I think, is what you need with art. Anyway, thoughts. So I'd love to see it.
Thanks very much, Elaine. I think it's a great point, and links to that point about the walking the city, and the places that we go where there's so much availability. I wanted to just bring in David Allistone, if I may, who has made a point directly linked to this, a social enterprise called Audioactive, which is moving into some empty or meanwhile space in Worthing. David, would you like to perhaps tell us a little bit about that, and then I'll come to the panel?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I run, well, I part run an organisation called Exploring Senses, CIC, and we're lucky to have a pop-up space on the seafront. But it was very temporary. It was like on a 3-monthly contract. Audioactive have occupied several spaces throughout the city, and they've just been given this amazing opportunity to take over 3 floors of Dorothy Perkins in Worthing, and they're going to make that their base. And that is an amazing opportunity, and it's going to be so awesome for like young people and families, and it's going to create a proper destination. So going back to what the lady before just said, sorry, I didn't catch your name. I mean, there are loads of empty spaces within the city of Brighton and Hove, but they're all seen as high value assets. And I totally get it, but until that's changed and it's become affordable and accessible, you're missing out on so much. I mean, there's so many artists, so many organizations, so many makers, crafts practitioners who could all shine in these spaces and add value to our city. So I guess, you know, I mean, Audioactive is a charity, so they can get a space, and it can be a rates reduction. But there are lots of CICs out there who aren't charities, and therefore they can't get these spaces. So is there something that could address that? I mean, can community groups get into spaces as well? You know, a pop-up is pretty cool, but it's not a long-term project, and you can't make any plans. So there's no longevity, there's no growth. It's all right to be there for 5 minutes or even 18 months on a 3-month contract, but there's no longevity, and that's my concern really for the residents and for the people who make. Yeah, it's quite loaded, sorry, but
no, great. No, no, thanks, David. I think it's a really good point. And on the more technical kind of aspects of that, I think Nick might say something about that towards the end of our session today, in terms of, you know, the sort of the challenges and realities of opening up spaces, perhaps. But in terms of just bringing it back to kind of Elaine, who talked about spaces that are more akin to what we might, you know, sort of traditionally kind of understand as art spaces, theatres and galleries, and then this use of the space that for the Audioactive are using, which is a social enterprise with a focus on music, working with, you know, young people from across the city to challenge to work along issues around mental health and their creative futures, as I understand it. And I'm really interested in putting that to the panel, that, you know, in the changing face of, you know, the high street and culture on the high street, what role does this strategy have in reinterpreting and re-evaluating that landscape of the city from what traditionally we would all recognize as retail on the high street, and everything that brought people together, versus something very, very different, and what that might look like. So I'm looking to Judith and Atif again, if that's all right, to just give us your perspective on that.
Okay, I think it's central. You know, I see that those kinds of spaces, internal, external spaces, you know, are part of the opportunity to make work, to exhibit work, but also for artists who wouldn't have the opportunity to collaborate, not necessarily just formalized individuals, but, you know, freelancers, etc. Potentially people who are out of work now, who are developing their creative practice, all of those kinds of individuals. You know, I take the point that, you know, short term does mean that you really can't put down roots. and maybe that something could be done about how to support that kind of infrastructure going forward, because I think it's important to kind of weave the kind of creative practice into the the nature of the city in ways which are kind of create a kind of more kind of rich tapestry than blocks of retail, blocks of artistic practice, kind of have them kind of intermingle, and maybe they in their own right will set up other kinds of collaborations, informal ad hoc collaborations, which I think that's where the value of some things begin. Yeah, and spaces like Churchill Square, a perfect theatre I think would be great. So yes.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Judith. And
raised hand, Dom, from
rare, fantastic. Yeah, and I'd like to bring Izzy in as well, if possible, after this
I'm
question.
Going to do something quite exciting and get them both in. So I'm going to allow Emily and then add Izzy as well.
Thanks. So who first, Ali?
We've got Emily live.
Emily. Hi, Emily.
Hi, I just wanted to say that, so I've been working creatively on London Road for about 10 years. And what we are doing at the moment is we are doing a feasibility study for a community laundrette, but it's being driven by an arts organisation. So the idea is that you start the art project with an act of care. So you're actually taking a step back. So you're trying to fulfill somebody's needs before they start being creative. So the idea is that we offer affordable laundry. People come in, hygiene poverty is huge on London Road. People come in, they come for the affordable laundry, and then we kind of move together towards the creativity, and there'll be artists and exhibitions in that space too. So, and that's, I really like what Judith's been saying about happening in different spaces, the importance of having creative and cultural activity in the spaces where people already are is going to be so important going forward. So yeah, that's where our thinking is on that.
I think that's a great thought about art in all its forms happening in places where people are, rather than necessarily places where they need to go to. I think it's a really interesting, rich theme and conversation there. Can I bring in Izzy, who had a note about performance, and it got me thinking your question, Izzy, about this idea of Elaine and sorry, I forget, I think it was David, and spaces, about how performance inside and outside of buildings, and how this role of performance in public art experience. Could you
I'm afraid Izzy isn't here anymore.
She's not here. Great.
No. One thing I would like to say is that Jane Willis is in the chat, and she's got quite a lot to say about social engaged public art addressing inequalities. Jane, would you like to join us? I've got two Jane Willises, so if you could please press raise hand if you'd like to join us and put your thank you. Welcome, Jane.
Go ahead, Jane.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's some amazing ideas being shared here and some brilliant work going on. I love that laundry idea that we just heard. But in a way, I think it's really important to move the discussion away from solutions, because, theatre in squares or art on the buses, in a way, those are all solutions. And I think the key thing, especially if we're thinking about inequalities, health, social care, social needs, the environment, is we have to start co-producing solutions with not just the communities, but also with a wider network of stakeholders. So moving out of the art silo and working in partnership with health, social care and environment stakeholders to actually not give them solutions, but co-produce solutions.
That's a brilliant point, Jane. Do you have experience in that area? Do you have anything that you could offer in by way of an example of where that's worked particularly well? I don't want to put you on the spot, but it seems something that you're fairly close to.
Well, I work in the arts, health and wellbeing sector, so my area of expertise is co-producing programs that support health and wellbeing with NHS health partners. I'm not based in Brighton, but in Brighton I'm responsible for delivering Connect, the public art programme for Brighton and Sussex University Hospitals NHS Trust, and have worked with Branwyn on that, who sits on our steering group for it. But I think if you look at what's happening in the arts and health field, there is a big emphasis on looking strategically at the kind of infrastructure that will enable the arts to be embedded in some of the solutions to the health and social care needs that we have across the country as a whole. So I think the best examples of practice are where you've got people working really closely in partnership with wider stakeholders as well as with communities. So it's back to that point earlier somebody raised about artist briefs. You know, before you even get to write the brief, what kind of co-production might have taken place to understand what the brief might be.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Jane. I think it's such a an important point about how, you know, in many ways the progress is the process itself. Could I come back to Judith and Atif just to build on those last few points, to give us your perspectives on that, and then we'll perhaps try and move the conversation on again.
Sure. I guess just to add to that, I agree. I mean, that's the cultural humility piece, isn't it? You know, and it takes us away from this top-down approach that we've got to have answers and solutions, and ensure that we are not being dictatorial with those answers and solutions. You know, there is a process. It is, and you know, we've got good examples of this. The Occupy movement, you know, and the guerrilla sort of guerrilla galleries. These sort of things are happening, where people are utilizing spaces, projecting, I guess, images and political discontent, and sometimes none of the above, just nice artwork, you know, which is quite righteous too. So it's making sure, but I think the trouble we're going to have, yeah, and we are seeing these polarized economies ahead of us, which is, you know, which is really clear, is, and in those spaces we are going to see people needing to occupy more of those spaces just to sleep, you know, and in those spaces, as we've seen in a lot of places in the world, forgotten towns that are then re-inhabited, you know, and made good by art and artists, and then suddenly become really trendy and then gentrified and wanting to be seen. So that's a constant motion that's happening all the time. But it's the agility of that that is really this thing that we're missing out on if it's not given space and if it's not welcomed. You know, and it does need to be welcomed. Yes, there's lots to think about, health, sanitation, etc. But it's also making sure, yeah, how do we welcome the spirit of that, and how do we benefit from its agility, especially when it is just being driven by lived experiences who just want to create their canvases, even if they've got to break the doors open to get to them.
Great, thanks, Atif. Judith, did you want to add anything before we try and cover off at least another couple of questions before we move to the next steps?
No, not really. I just wanted to just very briefly add, it's really important to remember that we don't know the answers, and to find the answer, i.e. the co-creation aspect. I think that was a really important point.
Great, thanks. I'm going to go.
One hand raised from Karen.
Great.
Should we?
Yeah, please do.
Great. Welcome, Karen.
Hi, hello everyone. Yeah, no, I'm just responding to the previous point. So I've got some experience of working across all these sectors. So my background is working in outdoor arts. I used to produce The Streets of Brighton many years ago, which is a fantastic example of taking art to where people are. And these days I kind of work across working in kind of outdoor arts, various different spaces, making installations, performances around the environment, sustainability, health and well-being. So one of my projects, for example, is a virtual reality piece, Unable to Work at the moment, which is in partnership with the Living Coast, which is the biosphere region. And then I have another project originally commissioned by the Brighton Hove Arts Commission, which is the Bicycle Ballet, which I'm trying to kind of do more of the co-creation. We do a lot of work with cycling departments and kind of sustainability transport, my world of cycling transport. And I'm kind of trying to sort of work more directly with some of those kind of transport departments but it's a very different world. You know, it's very kind of sort of statistics and, you know, all that kind of research and stuff. So that's my kind of next plan, is to develop some statistics around the community engagement aspects of what we can do. And yeah, fingers crossed for the next phase.
Great. Thanks, Karen. Really interesting to hear. We are running up against time a little bit, so I'm going to ask Ben Roberts to pick up on that point about community engagement, if that's okay with you, Ben. And then if we can, Melanie, I'd like to come to you after that. Ben, are you there?
No, I'm afraid we've lost Ben, so I'm going to welcome Melanie.
Melanie, yeah, I think where the points are linked.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Melanie.
So which I'm afraid I've been quite chatty on the chat box. So I don't know which of my many questions you want me to.
Well, one of your questions has proved really popular, and it's about sort of the freeness and accessibility question.
Yeah, so disclaimer here, I work in a museum, a national museum, and what we found, a number of studies that have been done by my colleagues in the learning and engagement teams, is that young people and diverse people don't recognize themselves in the free museums that we curate. I mean, this is something extraordinary that the UK has free museums. This is quite unique in the world. You know, if you go anywhere in Europe, you wouldn't be able to walk into a national collection for free. So this is really extraordinary. And in principle, this shows great accessibility and showing how collections belong to the nation and so on and so forth. But time and again, we find that actually our young population and our very diverse young population don't recognize themselves. They find that the displays might be stilted, or that the interpretation is not for them, or that the art that is shown doesn't speak to them. And what they're asking again and again is for someone to kind of unlock those narratives, to make them feel welcome, to, and you know, it's not as if we've found a solution and we can just use it like this. It's something that we keep scratching our heads on, you know, how do we make these accessible? And I think public art is the same thing. When you walk around the city and you look at an artwork, whether it's a temporary one or a permanent one, either it might be completely invisible because there's too much and it's kind of lost in the clutter of the city and there's too much to look at, or you might look up at something and you don't quite know how to respond to it, to engage with it, how it speaks to you.
Great points, Melanie. Atif, you're nodding. Would you like to give a brief response to that before we move to sort of the next steps of this process and bring things to a close?
Yeah, just that I'm a massive fan that Britain has free museums. It is incredible, but I think there is a kind of shock and awe of a kind, if that's a word I can use, when you are a young person, especially, you know, going into museums. I think about the British Museum all the time. Think, you know, the consistent legacy that, wow, you know, there's so much amazing stuff that got nicked, you know, and that reminder that you're not on top of this, you know, that you came from nation states that were so broken, I suppose, and that's quite hard to sort of take that process in, you know. It's that kind of, I don't know, that African proverb, you know, I think it's the child who's not embraced by the village will one day be destined to burn it down, just to feel its warmth. I know that's a very bleak statement or a tragedy, but it's sort of thinking, well, how do we reach out to folks if it isn't free celebration? Of course, it's history, but it's also history that's been tainted. And so it goes back to that same thing. How do we say, look, we owe such a legacy to so many places that weren't in Europe, and we're so indebted to that. And here's how we're welcoming it and celebrating it and showing it off to you, so that you're not a beneficiary. We are. And here's how we talk about it in England or the UK in our museums.
Great, thanks, Atif. Judith, any closing comment on that before we move on?
I mean, I think that's completely right. You know, I talked about talking about the past in the present is really important, coming at the thing from both ends. You know, I remember not going to museums when I was a young person, and actually not feeling that they were for me, but somehow becoming an artist and somehow finding myself in those spaces. But all of that was complete accident, in the sense that I, didn't engage with art when I was young. I'm sure there are all sorts of issues as to, getting in there, feeling like you're belonging in the space, being represented in the space, connecting to the artifacts and the archives with people who are from the place where those archives come from. Really important, I think. The phrase was unlocking the narrative, really important, because often the narrative is Eurocentric, and I think there are strides made to change that, to include other narratives, but that's also important.
Can I just jump in? Because Kelly Miller, thank you so much for your comment, Kelly, about the videos that we made and the language that we used. I'd really like you to say your point, if that's all right. Could you raise your hand? Would that be okay if you'd like to say your point? Thank you. Welcome, Kelly.
Oh, hi there. Thank you. It's been very interesting. Yes, I just found, I've been in the arts all my life, in various capacities, working with early years, working with universities. I have a gallery in Brighton. I'm an artist myself. But yet, I've done various Arts Council applications in the past. And I have to wear many hats, and often, if I'm about to enter into any institution or work with any organisation, it takes me a while sometimes to have to warm up my brain in terms of understanding the language used. So if I have that problem, can you imagine what that problem is for people that aren't in the arts? And I think, barring two of the videos, I just found that the language used was so abstract. And I pride myself in my gallery in making it accessible as possible. So whoever comes through the door, they have a way in. And we talk in a very simple language. I've done an arts criticism MA. And one of the first things they taught me is, why say things in 10 words when you can say it in 2? And I think we get into this language of flowery languages. I have several artists, I work with about 60 artists. And sometimes when you get those art statements, I spend at least 2 days having to edit it so that the everyday person can understand what they're saying. So I think we really do need to adopt and develop a language that is not art speak. And it does frustrate me. Today was lovely because everyone spoke as you would speak language-wise. We all understand each other today. But when we start to put on that sort of video and in front of the camera, I think we pretend to be things that we're not. And we really do need to develop a language that we can reach out to people. And that's the first point. Language is what we communicate with. And if we cannot adopt a single language, we are going to alienate a lot of people through this.
Great point, Kelly. Thanks for that. We are up against time, but I'm going to allow Judith and Atif to quickly respond to that, if that's okay, before we move on to the closing kind of comments.
Gosh, thank you for the reminder. It's very important. I come up against this, I think, because I straddle technology and art and working with developers and, describing, what I'd like to do with developers, and then getting a whole list of things and questions and positions I really don't understand. And I find myself going, well, what does that mean? Well, what does that mean? And, I similarly find the situation true in working with in the university. So often I will have a statement which is in university speak, followed by, what I mean by that is this. And I haven't figured out a way more to get around that because I do, we often straddle these various worlds that like different kinds of language, and really only take you seriously if you use this kind of embellished language. But You have to be able to communicate. I completely agree. Yeah, on board.
Thanks, Judith. A really kind of honest response there. Atif, anything to say on embellishment and flower, the unhelpfulness of flowery language?
Well, I think intent is it. I mean, language has power, right? I mean, it does. And, you know, my father told me once when I was a kid that the English language was taught down the barrel of a gun, you know, and it was trade or not trade. And that power stays in people where they don't examine. If the intent is still good, but it's not examining what language is preventing people from participating. So I just thought Kelly's point was absolutely right. It's yeah, it does have power, and I think sometimes people are using it to show off knowledge rather than to. And I think I'd like to think men can be guilty of that a lot more, but to show off knowledge as if, you know, I generally didn't know what placemaking was. I have to say, I said it in the video, and I hadn't heard the term before. And then I was like really weirded out to do a video talking about placemaking, and I said, I just don't know what that is. But at the same time, it was really wonderful, and it was lovely to hear the warmth from which the invitation was there. And so I guess, you know, we can do that too. Yeah. We've got to choose to.
Thanks, Atif. That's great, and thanks for the mention of placemaking, a fashionable word which many people don't actually understand what it means. So let's speak more straightforwardly. And thanks, Kelly, for making that point. We're going to move to sort of conclude things, and thanks for so much that we haven't got around to, but I'm pleased to see that we have answered you know, a whole bunch of questions. We were never going to be able to get through them all. I'm sure they'll be kind of kept and given thought and weaved into Ali's work ongoing. The conversation is not over as this session finishes. You could see that as very much just beginning. There's a couple of things in the Q&A about this, but it's really around Branwen and Nick's and Bridget's involvement about the kind of next steps. Where are we going with this? You know, what is the council going to do in terms of its implementation of the public art strategy? And there's a question in here about Katie would like to know what the council's declaration of a climate emergency will look like in the context of this strategy. But I wonder if I could come to Nick in the first instance. Nick, would you be able to talk a little bit about, you know, this consultation process and the development of the strategy and how it will be used from the council's perspective? And then perhaps if I could come to you, Bridget, to just sort of talk a little bit about how all of this is going to be woven together in the form of that strategy. Nick, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, thanks, Dom, and firstly, just thank you to everyone for what's been really a great event, and really interesting just to sit and listen to your points and to read your questions. One of the advantages of working digitally is it does enable us to engage widely, but I'm conscious that some of you have asked questions and won't have been able to participate directly. So we will ensure that all of those questions are captured and that your points and voices are heard. Just to remind you who I am. So I'm Nick Hibbard. I'm the Executive Director for Economy, Environment and Culture at the City Council. So I'm responsible for the Council's infrastructure services, but also our strategies around economy, culture, art, and also leading the City Councils and the City's approach to transition to carbon neutral, and our approach to recovery as we come through these challenging times. And I think some of the things that I've heard today really resonate in terms of the power of public art to be able to support communities with a sense of identity and belonging and connectedness with the city at a time perhaps when we're at a really pivotal moment as a city. And if you think about the times we're in, you know, we're post-Brexit and we're mid-pandemic and we're in the middle of a climate emergency. And they're just some of the things that are happening to us as communities and as a city right now. So I think there's a role to play, and that the timing is really right for us to think about what's the role of public art in supporting our city to recover and our city to move forward and to reset and to develop a sense of a
a fairer, a healthier, a more sustainable city. So I think there's a real opportunity for us to think about those themes in how we reimagine the city as we come through what has been a shock for all our communities. And I think there's a real role for public art to play in how we create that sense of connectedness and inclusiveness as we go through that process of recovery. One of the things that I've heard today, which I think is really important, has been around engagement, that theme of engagement and how we unlock people's voices and how we use public art to connect has come through over and over again. I don't know if Curtis is still on the line, but we heard you, Curtis, and I think your points about representation and on events like this are really well made, and perhaps we can talk to you about doing something about that afterwards. Sarah and Katie made some really important points about the process of promoting inclusion, tackling inequality, and how we engage both artists and communities in the work. And Steve talked about how we re-energize spaces and use art to really create that energy, which led us nicely on to part two, really, which was talking a lot around how we green the city and how we think about how we shape the future of the city in such a way that creates a livable city, a city which is more at the human scale, where people are able to slow down and be able to connect with art and with each other as part of reshaping the city. I just wanted to talk a bit about next steps. And we will be pulling all of the feedback together. As Dom said, this is the start of the conversation, not the end of the conversation. But the culmination of the work is aiming to go to our politicians for agreement around June of this year. So that's when we'll be taking it to a committee that's called the Tourism, Equalities, Communities and Culture Committee. So there will be some output, and there will be some opportunities to think about how the council commits to working with you all on a coherent public art strategy for the future. Because of time, I'm not going to say much more other than just to thank you all. I really think this is an important piece of work. I really think that this is the moment to do this work for this city, and I'm really grateful for your engagement today and the time that you've taken to participate. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Nick. We are right up against time here, but Bridget, would you like to say something briefly?
I'll be extremely brief.
Thank you.
This has all been about hearing what you all think, and although we've done some consultation already and some early research on the existing policies across the city, some of the initiatives and conversations with the cultural framework leads and the city council officers, but what's been the most important thing is literally today's contribution from yourselves. And we will look at the poll responses, all the questions raised today, a lot of issues that are new and that I need to think about in different ways. And we've still got the tell us your thoughts email up and open. So for the next couple of weeks, that and the poll, if there's things that occur to you now, do come back and tell us those. But what I'll do and the team I'm working with is begin to pull all this together and to identify, the shared vision, the vision that you have kind of begun to identify here, and some, fantastic things on the issues around participation and time and to allow for development, co-curation, co-production, the kind of open briefs, language. Really, really important, something I forget a lot, and I will kind of focus on that. But as Nick's just said, we'll use all of this information and then begin to articulate, what your collective vision is and the principles that we can then create for the strategy. And then we'll be working very closely with the development team across the council in terms of and the regeneration team to ensure that we align the strategy with the policy documents, because it's through some of those policy documents that we will be able to deliver the strategy and access finance. And as has been said earlier, it needs to be across the council. So we will be working as closely as we can with the parks teams, with the development teams, and there's kind of still in section 106 in terms of those kind of mechanisms, but also the communities, the health, well-being, and ensuring that we can try and bring together a lot of the things that you said today into a kind of coherent document. And as Nick said, we need to get all that kind of finalized for June, but our kind of deadline is the end of March, and then there'll be some for a draft document, and then there'll be some internal conversations with the council to ensure that it's acceptable to them. But I have to say, this is, fantastic today. Thank you all very much for contributing.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Bridget. Because we're over time, I'm really going to keep it brief and just say I've enjoyed today. I hope the experience for the people that have joined this consultation, it's been a good experience. The low dropout rate tells me that it perhaps has, but please do sort of feedback. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to hand back to Ali now very briefly to say any closing comments. Thank our panelists, Judith, Atif, Nick, Bridget and Branwen for being on our panel, and take care. Ali, anything that we need to do before you press the big red eject button?
Well, I've got the email on the holding slide, which I will keep up for 5 minutes or so, which is tell us your thoughts at lighthouse.org.uk, and please do send anything that we didn't cover. But I'm just so conscious that there are nearly 50 questions that we didn't really get to, and I'm wondering if it's worth thinking about how we can open up another Zoom, not necessarily with panelists, but just to have a point that we can record the conversation and hold it more so that we can inform Bridget and Nick's next steps even more. I think it might be worth it. So thank you so much for everybody's attendance. Much love, and we'll continue. But yeah, do get in touch if you need us.
Thank you, everybody.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye.